with an idea he had for a lecture. As an astronomer, his interest was sparked by an observatory in Magaliesberg, South Africa. In the 1970s, a delegation of researchers and astronomers from the University of Leiden did extensive research in this observatory. One of those researchers is Jan Willem Pel, who we also welcome here today. The time he spent here is special because in this same period, proof was discovered of an Iron Age settlement in Magaliesberg, which was at odds with the doctrine of the apartheid regime in that time that no culture could have existed in South Africa before Europeans set foot here. Jan Willem Pel will talk about his own experiences in South Africa in this period. And Lucas Ellerbroek heard his story and he decided that it deserved a broader telling. For example, here today in the Zuid-Afrikahuis. So we are happy to welcome them both. Please give a warm welcome for Jan Willem Pel and Lucas Ellerbroek.
Hello and welcome to you all, and also a special welcome to those of you listening, well, not overseas, but in South Africa, from Tshwane University and all the other listeners, anybody who is watching this online. It's good to have you here. Um, it appears that it is possible to interact with us. So if at any point you have a question, if you're in the audience, you can simply raise your hand. But if you're online, you can type this in the chat and our director will direct the question to the speaker in question. So yes, as Tara said, thank you very much for having us here. And indeed, um, I was made privy to this story by indirectly by Inja Snelle, who is the director of the Leiden, the current director of the Leiden Astronomical Institute at the University of Leiden, telling me that there was an unveiling of a plaque in South Africa that contained an interesting story where there's some of the um, senior astronomers at their institute are still around to tell us about this great story. And I heard it since, and I indeed thought it deserved a broader telling. And here I was cycling in Amsterdam and noticing the Zuid-Afrikahuis existed. I've lived around the corner here for 4 years and never ever noticed it. It was in a phase of my life that I was less concerned with my surroundings than maybe now. So then the ball started rolling. So I'm very happy to be here and to be the one relating this interesting story to you. So Jan Willem will kick off with the astronomical story, and then I'll, after the break, uh, tell a little bit more about the broader context of the area that the observatory is located in, and the discoveries made during the time that Jan Willem and his colleagues were there. So, Jan Willem, let me invite you. Thank you. Yeah, sure.
Yes. Thank you, Lucas. Can everybody hear me? Yes? Okay. Yeah, I will start off with the astronomical part of this story, which has many facets. Some of them, some of those are even a surprise to me. I have learned a lot of things that, although I have spent such a lot of time at this site, that at the time I was not aware of. Uh, I will tell the astronomical story. The surprising thing is that uh, what we as astronomers usually find the most interesting part of the sky, and that's the southern part, was basically until quite late in the 19th century was unknown territory. Uh, with very few exceptions, there were only a few observatories. Uh, the most important of those was the Cape Observatory, which had been established by the British in 1820 after they took over the Cape Colony from the Dutch during the Napoleon years. But this observatory, the British never put astronomy as their first priority. The main purpose of this observatory was timekeeping and calibrating the ship chronometers. That was most of their activity in the early years, and only late in the 19th century, around 1880, really important astronomical research started there. And that was a bit of a coincidence. Around 1980, a number of things happened more or less simultaneously. Just before that, David Gill had become director of Cape Observatory in 1877, and Jacobus Kaptein became astronomy professor in Groningen in 1878, a year later. And just before 1880, photography had been developed already decades earlier by people like Daguerre and Talbot. But the photographic plates in the beginning years were not usable for astronomy. They were wet plates. They were not very sensitive. It was almost impossible to work with those things. And then around 1880, the American firm Eastman Kodak invents the dry photographic plates, and that is the start of a technical revolution in astronomy, because now we can do photography behind telescopes. And David Gill is one of the first who realizes the importance of this. Another coincidence is that in 1882, there is the Great Comet of 1882, one of the brightest comets that has appeared in the past centuries. And several people try to make photos of this comet. David Gill sees a few examples of that, and then he thinks, oh, I can do that behind my telescope as well. So in 1880, Gill photographs this very bright comet, and you see one of his pictures here. And the comet is, of course, very interesting and very nice, but what Gill immediately notices is the large number of very, very faint stars on these plates. So he realizes, with this technique, I can record images of stars that are 100 times or even more fainter than the faintest stars that you can see with the naked eye. And then he makes the plan with this new photographic technique to start with making an atlas of the entire southern sky, which did not exist until then. So most of the sky had been explored only visually, so you could not get to very faint things, and it was almost impossible to cover big parts of the sky. But now with these photographic plates, you could cover big areas of the sky until very faint magnitudes. And Gill plans a photographic atlas of the whole southern sky. Well, this is a very time-consuming undertaking, and his staff is very small, and he has no means to do measurement of all these plates, because it's nice to make a plate, but what he wants to do is parallel to the plates, make a catalog with brightnesses and accurate positions of all the objects that he sees on his plates. And here Kaptein comes in. Kaptein was appointed astronomy director in Groningen, but he had no telescope. And whatever he did, he has tried it for many, many years to get his own instrument in Groningen. This never worked out. And Kaptein got in contact with Gill. Maybe they knew each other from previous years already. That's not completely sure. But Kaptein hears about Gill's plan, and he proposes, if you make the plates, we take them to Groningen, and I will do all the measurements. So in his institute, which is then called the Kaptein Astronomical Laboratory, because it was not an observatory, they had no telescope. In this laboratory, all these plates were measured, and a big catalog was produced with positions and brightnesses. An enormous work. Eventually, the southern sky was, I think, below minus 15 degrees only, so not even the complete southern sky was covered by more than 600 fields. But the number of plates that it took for this program was a multiple of that. In total, the catalog contained nearly 500,000 stars, down to a magnitude of nearly the 10th magnitude, which means about 100 times fainter than what the naked eye can see on a really dark night. And it was the last volume of this catalog, which were big books with tables after tables after tables. The last volume was completed in 1901 and published on the day of Kaptein's 50th birthday. And you see here the very modest instrument that Gill used in the Cape Observatory. It was only a 15 centimeter lens, so this size, very modest instrument. And the observatory in those days must have looked more or less like that. This is a drawing made some years earlier, but in 1880 it must have, 1890 it must have looked the same. Now after that, it was quiet for some years, but then again in 1923 there is an understanding between two men that starts a new phase of the connection between Dutch and South African astronomy. The first PhD student of Kaptein was Willem de Sitter. And even before his promotion, de Sitter spent a number of years at the Cape Observatory, where he met Innes. Innes was an amateur astronomer from Scotland who came to Australia, and from Australia moved to South Africa, and then became a staff member of the Cape Observatory and developed as a real astronomer, although he had started as an amateur. By the way, Gill started as a clockmaker in Aberdeen in Scotland. So Gill also started as an amateur. But Innes and de Sitter knew each other very well, and they could get along very well also. And de Sitter realized that there was a lot of work to be done in the Southern Hemisphere, and also that the Cape was not the ideal site to do so, because Cape Observatory, because of the marine requirements when it was started, was at sea level and in view of the harbor, because the time signals given by the Cape Observatory should be visible from the ships in the harbor. Now, the Cape is a rather windy place, and it is a slightly better climate than here for astronomers, but not very much. And in the meantime, de Sitter knew that in Transvaal it could probably be much better, and he had heard that Robert Innes had become the director of a new meteorological station in Johannesburg, on what is now called Observatory Hill, almost central Johannesburg now, 1,800 meters above sea level, in a much better climate, where especially during the winter, sometimes for months on end, there were clear nights. So Innes and de Sitter came together, and they made an agreement between the Leiden and Johannesburg observatories in 1923 that gave astronomers from both observatories access to each other's facilities. Now, it turned out, as far as observing is concerned, it turned out to be a rather one-sided operation, because for South African astronomers there was a little motivation to go to Leiden to do the observing. But there was another thing. In Leiden, there were famous professional astronomers, not only the sitter, but also Hertzsprung, and the students of those astronomers. And if these people would come to the new then still very small observatory of Innes in Johannesburg, Innes, of course, thought that he could profit from from those contacts. Now, in the early years, the most productive instrument at what was then first called the Transvaal Observatory, and then very soon it was renamed the Union Observatory, and still later it became the Republic Observatory. But that's not important. I call it the Union Observatory. The most productive instrument in most of those early years was the Franklin Adams telescope. Franklin Adams also had the telescope also had an amateur background. Franklin Adams was a wealthy British amateur astronomer who built his own observatory, ordered his own telescope with the explicit aim to make a photographic atlas of the northern sky and eventually also of the southern sky, but then with much bigger plates, with a wide field camera, which would be much more practical in use and also going to much fainter objects. Well, he had the money to order a telescope. Actually, it was a photographic camera, which was at the time very sophisticated. And you see an image of this telescope here. He first put it up in his private observatory in northern England. And when the plates in the north were made, he transferred it to Cape Observatory in Cape Town. There, the southern sky was photographed, and the complete atlas was published by Greenwich Observatory in, I think, around 1900. I don't have the date here now. And after that, Franklin Adams donated the telescope to the new observatory in Johannesburg because he knew that in Johannesburg they had only a very small telescope in those days, and they would it was a good climate there and much better than in Cape Town, and they would very happily accept this offer. So the Franklin Adams moved to Johannesburg in 1909. And for many years, this telescope was the main instrument at the Union Observatory. Now, although the collaboration between Johannesburg and Leiden had been started by the sitter, the main drive behind this work was Hertzsprung, a Danish astronomer who had come to Leiden and became the co-director of Leiden Observatory together with the sitter. And Hertzsprung was eventually he was mostly interested in doing real physics. He wanted to do astrophysics on stars, not just mapping the sky and doing statistical work. And no, his goal was we should do physics. And that meant observing individual stars. But yeah, if you make a picture of a star and you make a picture of the star the next day, it doesn't tell you much more. But Hertzsprung immediately realized that there are variable stars, and variable stars give you a handle on their physical properties. So he started big programs on variable stars. A program of many fields, mostly in the plane of the southern Milky Way. These fields were photographed and photographed and photographed again. And then these plates were compared with each other to detect anything that was variable. And then long series of photographic plates were taken of these discovered variable stars to derive their light curves and their periods. And many variable stars, once you know these periods, give information about their absolute brightness, and therefore you can derive their distance. And in that way, you get information about the physics of the stars, but also about the distribution of the stars and the structure of our Milky Way. So that was the reasoning behind Hertzsprung's programs. Most of this work until 1940, no, until, yeah, close before the war, most of this work was done with the Franklin-Adams telescope, but Hertzsprung wanted a bigger telescope. Uh, and he eventually got the money to do that in, I think, well, the date I don't have, doesn't matter. He got a Rockefeller grant uh, of about 100,000, a bit more than $100,000, which in those days was a huge sum of money, because with that money he could order this telescope. If you would order something like that nowadays, it would cost you millions. But he could order this telescope, which was then called the Rockefeller telescope. And this was a very special thing because it was a twin telescope. It was, in fact, two telescopes specifically designed for photographic work, wide field objective lenses. The lenses, Hertzsprung was extremely ambitious in the specification of these lenses. And it turned out that these objectives could only be made as quadruplets. So each of the objective lenses consists of 4 components of very special kinds of glass. That was really a challenge for the telescope makers. Eventually, it was installed in Johannesburg in 1983, but Hertzsprung was not satisfied with the quality of the lenses, and after a battle with the manufacturers, it was decided that for a small sum, Leiden Observatory was permitted to use the rejected lenses, and that new lenses, according to the specifications, would now be made by the firm Zeiss. Zeiss started working on these lenses, and then World War II broke out and everything came to a stop. And as a result of that, work in Johannesburg was going on with the temporary lenses during the war and a few years after the war, but the final lenses arrived only in 1949. In the meantime, another technical revolution had taken place. Photoelectric cells had been used in astronomy already in the 1930s, but during the war, so-called photomultiplier cells were developed, and these were far more sensitive and far more practical in use. And the result of that was that immediately after the war, photographic plates as detectors were rapidly replaced by photoelectric cells, photoelectric multipliers, and a whole generation of new instruments was developed for these new detectors. And one of the pioneers in this field was Theodor Walraven, who had studied in Amsterdam but came to Leiden. And he was a genius instrumentalist. He was extremely productive in inventing all kinds of new optical techniques. And that the result of that was Walraven went to the southern station, then still in Johannesburg, and instead of doing photographic work with the Rockefeller telescope, he built several instruments based on photoelectric techniques, and they started to do photoelectric photometry. And I have here, I could have shown many examples, but this is a nice example of one of Walraven's instruments. This was an ingenious 2-channel differential photometer, which could simultaneously observe 2 stars and record the difference in brightness between these stars with very high precision. And you see here the really superb accuracy that he achieved. And automatically, uh, in real time, light curves came out of this instrument. So Walraven and his wife sat behind the telescope, drinking a cup of coffee now and then, and on the recorder, these light curves were were rolling out. It was really completely new way of observing. Now, these stars, these two, Walraven was fascinated by this type of star for the rest of his life, and he now and then he came back to them and did new measurements. These were pulsating stars, but the peculiarity about these two cases, AI Velorum is one, and Acid Lenses is another one, that these stars pulsate with multiple periods at the same time. So you get very strange interference effects between these different periods, so that the light curve, every time that you look at the star again, the light curve has changed its shape. Now, Johannesburg was a boom town, and uh, already around 1950, the astronomers of Union Observatory realized that the city smoke and city lights were really becoming a serious problem, and they started to look for a better location. And they selected a site near the lake at Hartbeespoort, some 50 kilometers to the north of Johannesburg and some 35 kilometers west of Pretoria. They selected a site there and decided to move the Franklin Elms telescope to that new site. And then, Leiden thought for some time about this. Shall we follow? Shall we not follow? There were also other possibilities. But in the end, Leiden Observatory decided to follow this move and to move also the Rockefeller telescope there. And you see here, the Rockefeller was installed in 1957. You see here the big parts of the Rockefeller frame being installed on the new site. This is André Muller here, uh, one of the Leiden astronomers who spent several years at the Leiden Southern Station in Johannesburg, and after that moved to the new site near Hartbeespoort. And here you see the Franklin Adams telescope now in its new housing in the new Southern Station and the Rockefeller. The photo that I showed before was also a photo taken when the telescope was already at the new site. I could not find photos of the Rockefeller in its old location in Johannesburg. This was not the only thing that happened, because in the meantime, when people were thinking about the move to the new site, Walraven had returned from Johannesburg to Leiden and started to develop a much more ambitious photoelectric instrument. This instrument was in fact a combination of 5 photometers, you could say, and a spectrograph. In the spectrograph, the light of a star or another object was split in its different colors, and then with a very sophisticated filter made of crystal optics, that light was filtered in 5 very specific passbands, color filters, you could say, and these filters were carefully chosen at strategic wavelengths in a stellar spectrum. Uh, this way, the output of these 5 different filters could be measured simultaneously, which was an enormous advantage in observing efficiency, but also in observing accuracy, because it made the instrument much less sensitive to changes in the atmosphere during the measurement. And together with the spectrograph, they developed in Leiden a new, now reflective telescope, no longer with lenses but with mirrors. and the design of the telescope and the photometer were intimately connected. So you could say the telescope was designed such that it could hold the instrument and not the other way around. Well, this so-called light collector telescope with a main mirror of a bit more than 90 centimeters, together with this 5-channel photometer, came also in 1957 to the new site near Hartbeespoort. It was installed there in the course of 1957, and the observation started in 1958. You see here preparations. Here the base of the telescope is prepared by Meester, who was the chief instrument maker from Leiden, and I'm the same André Muller again. And here, one of the big parts of the light collector telescope is moved into its building. Now, with the new light collector and photometer, this became the main instrument at the new observatory. Now and then, people from Johannesburg came to take a few more plates with the Franklin Adams telescope. The Rockefeller telescope uh, became actually more or less obsolete because you could do far better work with the light collector. So big programs with this new equipment were started, mostly on massive young stars and on pulsating variables of different types, both in the galaxy and in the Magellanic Clouds. And several Leiden astronomers moved to South Africa, and these programs extended over several years. I was there in 1967 as a student working on one of these programs, and then again together with my wife Titia, who was also here, we spent 1970 and most of 1971 at the station, and then together with Jan Lup, who was also here, we observed for more than 2 months in 1978, and all of these programs were on pulsating variable stars in the southern sky, both in the galaxy and in the Magellanic Clouds. Now, in the early 70s, we were very lucky that it became possible to make a much more physical interpretation of the photometric data that we were collecting. In the early 70s, theoretical spectra were calculated by people like Kouroots and others. And Jan Lup and I were lucky to get access to these new spectra. And by calculating theoretical colors for our 5-color photometry, we could calibrate this photometry in terms of physical parameters. So we could translate the color measurements that we did to physical quantities like temperature, pressure, some index for chemical composition, and that opened a completely new field of interpretation. And this was really the big step to real astrophysics. Now we could do what we had wanted all those years before. I should mention here also that during the years near Hartbeespoort, David Stevenson for most of the time was the station manager. You see him here working on the light collector. And by that time, the photometer had already looked differently because in the meantime, quite early on, it was clear that these detectors should be cooled. So they were cooled with solid carbon dioxide to a temperature of about minus 80 Celsius. So the photometer, as Walraven installed it originally, had already changed quite a bit. Here is David working on the telescope. He took care of not only all management of the station, but especially he was the technical support. He did all of that, mechanical, electronically. So he was a great help, and without him, work there would have been completely impossible. So he was there until end of 78. The station was closed. Uh, some time ago, David sent me a copy of the welcome card that he got when he started work at the station in 1962. And yeah, I can recognize the signatures of many people that I know or have known. Eventually, also at Hartbeespoort, the observing conditions got worse and worse. Not only Johannesburg was expanding, but Pretoria also, and in Pretoria, especially the IJscore steelworks produced a lot of smog, which then drifted down the valley, and so in Leiden, one got more and more worried, and eventually in 1978, it was decided to move the light collector to the new observatory of the European Observatory on La Silla in Chile. This observatory had started in the late 60s, and around 78 it was really a fully working observatory with several telescopes. The climate there was excellent, and the Netherlands were a member of the European Observatory, so it was relatively easy to get permission for this move. And the result was that the station at Hartbeespoort closed by the end of 1978. Jan Lup and I spent there a few months in 78 to do a lot of measurements that would be helpful in the transfer of the South African photometry to the Chile photometry. The telescope and a thoroughly refurbished photometer arrived in Chile early 1979 in January, and observations started in March 79 again. And there the telescope and its photometer started a very productive new life, which lasted until 1991. You see here Jan Lup at the telescope, and now with the refurbished photometer, this time in a dome. In South Africa, we were open. We had this roll-off roof, and we were open in plain air. But here we had a dome, and a lot of work on many different types of objects was done from La Silla until eventually in 1991 the the observation stopped, and the telescope was put out of action for the first time after 1957. During the whole period from 1971 till 78, Arnold van Genderen was almost all the time the permanent observer in Hartbeespoort. So he lived there with his wife and daughter. And he is not only a very experienced astronomer, but he was also a dedicated amateur archaeologist. Now, there were rumors years earlier already that one could find prehistoric artifacts on the site. I had been told so by the Walravens already in 1967. Arnold knew that also, and he started looking around. And he found very interesting things. He found pottery. He found evidence of iron melting. He also found Stone Age, probably much older Stone Age tools. And at some point, he contacted the professional archaeologists at the Witwatersrand University, so they came over. And they were astonished by what they found, because it turned out that what is now called the Toppies Hoek site is a really unique archaeological site. And this subject will be will be discussed by Lucas in the second half of this presentation. I will end here by pointing out that the closure of the Leiden station at Hartebeespoortdam was not the end of the collaboration between Dutch and South African astronomers. And especially in recent years, there are many contacts, particularly in connection with the very big new radio telescope that is now almost complete, I think. That is being built, has been built in the northern Karoo. It has the name Meerkat, and it consists of many radio telescopes. And I know, for instance, from my institute in Groningen, several astronomers go there regularly and observe there remotely. So the contact between Dutch and South African astronomers is frequent and intense up to the present day. And I will now go back to my first slide. This is the sky with the Milky Way and the two Magellanic Clouds, our closest neighbor galaxies in this immense universe. And yeah, this is what we went for. Thank you.
Break down until 15 minutes of a break.
Have there been questions? I cannot see that here.
No questions asked in the chat.
Oh, okay.
All right, then we'll go on a break. Hallo, welcome back. Ik realiseer me dat ik ook best Nederlands zou kunnen spreken, voor de meeste luisteraars ook in Zuid-Afrika. Want in mijn eigen ervaring, ja, dat hebben ze ook gezegd. Ik ga wel door in het Engels, maar ik wilde toch nog eventjes memoreren. Ik heb jullie verzoek ook gehoord, but I will continue in English. So, yes, after this very interesting lecture by Jan Willem, who let us know how in the southern hemisphere astronomers discovered how to look at stars as things with a beginning and an end, not something eternal, but also things that can be considered as physical objects that emerge, develop, evolve, as they say, and then end their lives, inverted commas. And to me, as an astronomer, this has always been amazing. And I like to make comparisons within science to things, everyday things. And a group of stars I would maybe compare to a city. And a life of a star, well, stars are not alive, uh, but if you would compare it to a human life, has many differences. But still, it is nice to put one to another and to study a group of individual stars to say something about the group. And astronomers did this looking up. But while you and your colleagues were there, I should mention that Jan Lub, who is mentioned in the story, is also in the audience. Um, while you were there looking up, also down on the ground, a lot of things were discovered, and that had more to do with humanity. So let me do something that astronomers also like to do, zoom out again, and also introduce you to one other astronomer in this band, Arnoud van Genderen, emeritus professor in Leiden, who was one of the astronomers I visited among Jan Willem as well, and who told me the story of him and Jan Willem and the astronomers in the 70s and what they discovered. Um, this is a fairly recent photo of Arnoud still working on astronomical problems, mainly having to do with very big stars, the biggest stars in the universe. Hypergiants is a name that I believe he coined himself. Stars more than 100 times the size of the sun, and basically massive stars at the end of their lives who swell up and eventually will explode at some point. I mean, look at this. This is a star which is really about to explode. And this is a headline that his research made in the 90s. Another one was much more recent. I believe this is just like 5 to 10 years ago. Um, and he is still immersed in research for all his life. Um, I've been told, and I know I met him, he's a very modest man. He doesn't like to stand in the spotlight personally. Still, he made headlines. And this is one of the headlines that he made in the 70s. And this is actually what the second part of this lecture is going to revolve around. The things that Arnoud found when he was an astronomer in the Leiden Southern Station near Hartebeespoortdam in Magaliesberg. Now, Magaliesberg is a region that I will introduce a bit more in detail. And this is a testament to, or I mean, I should acknowledge, and I believe that both of them, or maybe one of them, is also in the audience. If you are, welcome and glad to have you here. Vincent and Jane Carruthers, environmentalists in South Africa. They're big names, I understand, and their work has really made the region where the observatory is located, um, yeah, a very prominent one. And people around the world now realize what a special area this is. And he has coined the name Cradle of Life, and in more than one way, I think a lot of things converge in this area of South Africa. I've never visited the area consciously. I have been to South Africa, but if I go back, I'll make sure to visit it because there's many natural wonders to see. Another name that I should mention here is Revel Mason. It's been mentioned by Jan Willem as well, an archaeologist who was one of the leading scientists who discovered the anthropology and the remains of what happened around Magaliesberg. I'll get into that later. I'll follow along the line of the book by Vincent called Cradle of Life, where he makes a beautiful zoom out of different fields of science and the way in which they are visible and are developed, or whose development can be seen in Magaliesberg. Now, I'll just brush over a lot of things here, and also I'm an astronomer. I'm interested in a lot of things. I know very little about very many things. So bear with me. It's a couple of disclaimers that I'm not a geologist, I'm not an anthropologist, so I might be a bit scratching the surface here, but it's just meant to introduce you to the richness of this area. And to me, it's completely clear why in 2015 the Magaliesberg Biosphere, well, as it is called now, is proclaimed a heritage site, an international biosphere reserve by UNESCO. So this is ensuring that the heritage, both the natural and the cultural heritage within it, are going to be preserved, or at least that is something that doesn't happen in and of itself, but still it has this status. So many people will work towards preserving this in the future and promoting its importance. Now, where is this located on a map? It's close to Pretoria and Johannesburg, as has been mentioned before. So slightly to the west of Pretoria. This area is the Magaliesberg Biosphere Reserve, and actually it's a mountain ridge. And this mountain ridge, the way that it was created is an interesting story in itself. But as a result of its creation, a lot of the history of the area is recorded here. In this way, it is similar to astronomy, where we study the stars, which are very old or have been around for very long. We're not, although some of them are variable, we will never ever witness a star from beginning to end. So the way that we know that stars have a beginning and an end is that we study different stars in different stages of their life as like a snapshot. Now, geology, I think, has many similarities with astronomy in the sense that we are considering processes that happen over billions of years. Superhuman timescales, like superhuman. I mean, I can't even imagine 100 years, 1,000 years. Well, in a history book, I have it, and like 10,000, a million years, a billion years, I really cannot imagine. To me, people say, yeah, you study astronomy, the universe is so big, I really can't cope with those distances. To me, the distances, yes, they are huge, but at least I can visualize them. With time, I cannot. So deep time, to me, is even more daunting than large distances. And geologists are people who, well, they are quite comfortable with deep time, just as some astronomers are. Now, just for your information, this is where the Southern Station is located, very familiar to some of you in the audience. And so it's really at the heart, well, it's at the edges, but in the poetic heart of the cradle of life. Now, the cradle of life. Let's put this into context, just like Vincent Carruthers just does in his book, but this is an image of a presentation that I like to give about the history of life in 1 hour. So just for your information, to the best of our understanding, the Earth has been around for 4.5 billion years. And if we would cram that time into 1 hour and then calibrate when certain stages of life emerged, it helps us put this into perspective. And it might help you put some of the numbers that I will flash on the screen also in perspective. So if life emerged at 0 hours, 0 seconds, and the present day is 1 hour later, let's walk you through what happened in between. So Earth forms 4.5 giga years, so the GYR, that's a billion years, giga years, as gigabytes. So 4.6, so it's a 4 with 9 zeros. That's how much a billion is. Life emerges after about 9 minutes already, when the Earth has cooled sufficiently. The first single-celled organism type things emerge. The first fossil remains of those date from 3.5 billion years ago, and they're seen as these big plaques of it's sort of like moss. Stromatolites is called. Very boring organisms, actually. They don't use or produce oxygen. In fact, oxygen is toxic to these things. They're, yeah, very basic life forms for whom, well, they don't have hobbies, but still, it is life. So as soon as it was possible, life emerged on our planets, as soon as the conditions were there. Now, that sounds good, but it still was a long time before the dinosaurs, because the next interesting thing happened after, well, another 50 minutes or another 1.5 billion years, which is the emergence of photosynthesis. So the conversion of carbon dioxide into oxygen, which was to some bacteria or some single-celled organisms very, very favorable. But for most life on Earth at that time, it wasn't. Oxygen was like uh, kryptonite to those things. So most of life really vanished from the planet. And this happened actually a couple of times. Like mass extinctions is actually what over large timescales propelled evolution, but this is the first moment of its kind. Oxygenic photosynthesis really transformed the way that our planet was populated, but it took um, well, another 20 minutes for actually multicellular life to emerge. So 3/4 of the time it was just single-celled organisms, and multicellular life emerged about 1 billion years ago. From then on, plants developed first um, on land. The first life emerged in the animals emerged in the sea, and the dinosaurs. Let's just skip ahead. They only are present 3 minutes before the hour. Humans, you can imagine, was only in the last second, and our species, actually, our agricultural revolution took place in really the last fragment of a second. So a lot of what we consider history is really condensed in a very, very tiny sliver of the Earth's history, and even prehistory um, is just a little bit more. And geological history, the Earth is a very geologically active planet. It renews its surface all the time. I mean, when I say all the time, I mean like over millions of years, which is really fast on a geological timescale. So actually, yeah, from it's only 10% of this record. If you dig deep, the oldest layer is about 500 million years old. So on this timescale, that's only like, um, well, 5 to 10 minutes before the hour. So that's just scratching the surface, quite literally. So if we talk about dinosaurs are old, yes, they are, but on this time scale, they're actually quite young. Just to put it in perspective. Now, a lot of interesting things happened or are visible, the scene happening in the Magaliesberg area. Close to the reserve, there's the Vredevoort crater, which is one of the biggest crater remains found on Earth. It was a asteroid which was 10 to 15 kilometers in size. It's actually bigger than the one that killed the dinosaurs 67 million years ago. But it happened during this period where you barely had photosynthetic bacteria. So not many dinosaurs died in this one because they didn't exist yet, but it was a huge happening in this area, which makes it geologically interesting. Also, the fact that it remains, it's one of the few geological remains of that period in early Earth's history. And this is what it looks like. So there's this dome, which is just the center of the crater. So when the asteroid impacts, just like a pebble in the water. If you throw it in the water, then it creates a puddle, but then the center of that puddle has the water flowing back up. Same thing happens when you do the same thing with rock. It heats and it becomes liquid, and you have this sort of thing standing up. So that's what you see here. Still to this day, you can see it. But if you consider the larger crater, it extends almost 100 kilometers in size. It's huge. And this makes it an interesting geological site. to start with this coincidental happening. Now, around the same time, the landscape actually transformed, and that went through another process called plate tectonics. So the Earth consists of land plates, which are actually floating on magma, which is semi-fluid. So they're just these continental plates, scales drifting there, and there's these points where they hit each other or where they rip apart. So again, I'm not a geologist, but at this point, the Earth crust was a layer cake of sediments that built up over the billions of years. But some heating took place on the magma locally, which made it kind of tilt and then shift and kind of fold up. So you see all the layer cakes. I don't know if you like spekkoek, I do, which is all these different layers. Who's one of those people who just dismantles the layers of spekkoek? Yeah, that's me. Okay, so if you want to do that in a geological sense in this area, well, you're in for a treat because what happened is basically the landscape tilted 90 degrees, and you can see in these ridges, you can see that they actually reflect deeper layers, but they're put on their side. So you can like, if you walk from east to west, you actually walk forward in geological time, which makes it for geologists, well, it's like a playground for geologists. Now, in this area, also a lot of things happened after this development. There was a big volcano that erupted that put the whole thing in lava, which well, eroded the landscape, but also made for fossils to be well, emerging or being conserved. Also, the whole continent shifted on the Earth and at some point was at the South Pole about zero point 0.5 gigayears ago. Remember, around the time when the land plants emerged, Africa and this area were at the South Pole, which made it kind of get a lot colder than it is now. And subsequently, the Gondwana is one of the mega continents that was at that time. You see here Africa's putting next to Antarctica. Africa kind of, or Gondwana kind of ripped apart from the other part of the continent, which had a lot of different consequences. But eventually, about 200 million years ago, Gondwana broke up and Africa was born. So this is basically, in a nutshell, how the landscape emerged to its present state. And a lot of history of the Earth is contained and can be read as a history book in the landscape of Magaliesberg, which is kind of like a hotspot of geology. Now, at the same location, specifically in Africa, I think all of us who are present here are familiar with the hypothesis, which is kind of the leading hypothesis that early hominids evolved first in Africa, in the continent of Africa. So the earliest fossil remains of human bones, either fossilized or direct bone fragments, are found in Africa. I always thought it was only in East Africa, but apparently there's also a lot of sites in the south of Africa, specifically concentrated around the Magaliesberg area. So this is our understanding of how human hominids evolved. I mean, there's different predecessors of Homo sapiens. So in this time, the time goes up, and the most recent example is on the top left. That's Homo sapiens. That's us. And as you know, we had many predecessors, some of which just represent lines that actually are no predecessors, but they're lines that died out. For the Neanderthals are an example, which maybe merged at some point. There's maybe some Neanderthal in some of us, but there are other examples of species that are not continued. But a lot of these are found in Africa, and these sites within the cradle of life. So this is the southern eastern part. You see here's the observatory, the northeast corner, but this is a lot. These are a lot of sites where human remains or hominid remains are found, and these are examples of the species that are found in the Magaliesberg. So basically, the cradle of life. I get what Vincent Carruthers, why he called it this. It's not only the cradle of life, but it's also the cradle of humanity in a way, which makes it just a very rich area for scientists and also for realizing our own beginnings. Now, once Homo sapiens emerged as the dominant species, it migrated across the globe. And these are just some hypotheses of when that happened. Supposedly from Africa. I mean, there are different hypotheses. I realize I'm not an anthropologist, but just common consensus says that from like 120,000 years ago, uh, people started migrating from Africa, and it's really gained momentum around 75,000 years ago. From there, it spread into Asia, from there onto America, and lastly, Australia, Oceania. So that's how humans spread across the globe. It all started in Africa. But also within Africa, of course, there was a lot of migration. Specifically, and now I'm skipping ahead along a lot, but this is like from 5 millennia ago, so 3,000 before Christ. Um, Africa was populated across the whole continent because we saw early human remains in southern Africa. So in situ, a lot of humans evolved actually and just made civilizations. But there were also civilizations which migrated from more northern parts, like specifically West Africa. A lot of civilizations migrated southwards. So the groups we consider here are the Khoikhois are the the kind of tribes, civilizations in southern Africa, but they got visited by the Bantu civilizations, which were from more up north. And this happened around, well, starting five, but maybe like until 3 millennia ago. This is when they also, the Bantu people also hit southern Africa. And these happenings were all clashes of civilizations or mergings of civilizations. A lot of different cross pollinations happened in this rich migration history, which I think in this house is something which is richly studied as well. So I've become interested in this, and again, I'm telling this as a layman, but just relating some things that are important for the context of what Arnold and the archaeologists found um, in southern Africa. Because of the early Stone Age, but also the Iron Age, different types of fragments are found across Africa. So we see these primitive tools, some of which are actually carried here by Jan Willem and exposed here. You can see them. Are there any Iron Age? Okay, yes. So both of those were actually found also close to the observatory site. And these are all little pieces of evidence of the presence of humans and in that area. Now, within Magaliesberg, I will brush over this. I really can recommend you to read the book and order it on Amazon or, well, preferably another website. Uh, Anywhere, get Vincent Carruthers' book. It's really a great read, and it tells you a lot of science history. It also tells you a lot of South African history. And I wouldn't do honor to the book or to the topic by brushing over it now, but I have to make choices. Um, a lot of other things happened in South Africa throughout history, and also within Magaliesberg, there's a lot of remains of, for example, the battles between the Boers and the British, which took place also around that site. So there's a lot of South African history contained in this area. Now, let's skip ahead to the Leiden Southern Station. So this is the Magaliesberg. You see the mountain ridge, and to the right you see the Hartepeespoort, the lake near the Hartepeespoort Dam, which is here. Zooming in, this may look familiar now a little bit, and this is the location of the observatory. This is Google Maps, and it's still there. The houses that were built were still there. Not all of them. The telescopes are gone, of course, but some of it remains intact, and we hope that it will remain intact and will also be more taken care of, um, or that well we will be able to conserve it in a better way. Um, so this is the site where Jan Willem, Arnoud, and Jan and their colleagues were stationed in the 70s. Now this is a picture. It's an aerial photograph. It was an Arnoud's position, and Jan Willem digitized it. This is the site, but looking up from the lake southwards. And yeah, it's not visible that well, but in the middle you see these houses. This is actually where your station was. And this is an aerial map of the same site. Well, was before we had these satellite photos, so it's really an aerial photograph. And if you look closely, it's annotated here. Um, Again by Arnoud. So these are the features of the observatory grounds. But here, 1 to 4, are actually sites where Arnoud found things. So let me tell you a little bit more about Arnoud van Genderen. Like I said, he is a astronomer, a very dedicated astronomer. He's a very nice man, and he is also a very curious man. So from an early age, he grew up in former East India, in Indonesia, actually, which at the time was Dutch Indonesia. And he took a lot of expeditions by himself when he was young. And he started from an early age also to look around him at nature, but also um, anything he found, he would examine. And he developed an early interest in archaeology as well. And he remained an archaeologist, and well, he says an amateur archaeologist, but with significant contributions for all his life. And this is a practice that came natural to him when he was one of the astronomers who was stationed in South Africa. And indeed, in the same area, a lot of archaeological finds were done already, but he contributed to that just by walking the observatory grounds and finding all kinds of stuff. So these are hut floor remainders that existed. He didn't find all of this. These are sites that were actually already known, but these are also examples of what he found there. Hut floor remainders, iron smelters, and jar fragments, fragments of pottery which were decorated. And human bones were also found there. Well, these are all kinds of things that Arnoud actually brought back. And he collected all of these in one big box. And at some point he thought, well, apparently there's a lot of archaeologists at work here as well, so I may as well just bring it to them to see what they think. So he went to the University of Witwatersrand and knocked on the door of Revel Mason, the chief archaeologist in charge of the whole operation, and said, well, look at what I found. And he said, okay, he didn't throw away, but he kind of neglected all the Stone Age fragments. He's like, yeah, okay, it looks nice. But then he saw these things, these decorated pottery fragments, pot shards. And he said, where did you get these? So there was not one of them. There was a whole big box of them. That's when Revel Mason uh, stood up and went down the corridor and shouted to his colleagues, guys, come and look here. So they all came downstairs and they were amazed by what he found. He said, I spent the last 25 years of my professional life looking for these. I just found one, and you found a whole box of them. So he basically hit the mother lode and, well, invited, of course, Revel Mason to the site. And actually, they got immediately weren't allowed to do any more digging there because they left it to the archaeologist professionals. But I'm sure that he contributed. He continued to be contributing to it. Especially he was still connected to this field for a long time. And this is Revel Mason, the recently passed away archaeologist who really made all these fragments. So what made these early Iron Age fragments so special? Actually, they formed evidence of the presence of a Bantu village around the fifth century of our age that already existed there with a rich culture, with well, very sophisticated tools and pottery and basically industry, iron smeltery, a lot of things that were evidence of a culture that had been present there for centuries. Now, again, and these are just some photos that were taken in the 70s of those diggings, and these are Dutch press releases. Like this is the one in the middle is the local Leiden University newspaper. To the left is NRC, one of the major Dutch newspapers, and to the rest is an archaeological journal, which Arnoud published his findings as well. And here, so this is a good moment to consider what age they were living in. In the 70s was basically the low point of apartheid. I mean, the low point, high point, how you want to call it. It was not a very pleasant age there. The regime, the apartheid regime, was at the height of its institutionalized racism. And this is a society, well, you were actually present in that society. We just talked about it, that the observatory was quite remote. So you fortunately weren't so immersed in apartheid in daily life, but it existed in the regime around you. And these kind of finds were, well, to put it mildly, controversial. I mean, they were pursued by universities like Witwatersrand University, which was more like an opposition university, but it took a long time before the apartheid regime was lifted. And this was evidence that when Europeans set foot in South Africa, there had been civilizations around there for centuries. Culture didn't start with the European settling of the African continent. And this was a reality that at least the regime at the time in South Africa hadn't come to terms with, it wouldn't accept it. So in the Netherlands, in the 70s, there was a strong anti-apartheid movement. For some reason, the Dutch were quite front runners in their indignation about the situation in South Africa. Um, their their ancestors were one of the first settlers who, well, basically contributed to the start of apartheid before it was called apartheid. Apartheid is a Dutch word, of course, but there is a strong um, feeling in the Netherlands towards apartheid, and in that time, I mean, it was before my time, but Arnoud's finds stirred quite a bit also here in the Netherlands, and I should emphasize, Arnold told me I should emphasize his finds were just contributing to the whole operation, mainly led by Revel Mason, which was already in place. So he mainly just contributed to that. It was not his discovery, but it was a discovery that was made during his time there. And yeah, it's also something that took a long while to sink in. And I'm not sure, and this is an open question, maybe also to the people of Zuid-Afrikahuis, maybe for after for to have a drink with. Um, in what way this actually contributed to the emancipation of South Africa throughout the apartheid regime? Um, yeah, there's a long story to tell, I think, from the 70s up to 94 when Mandela became president, in which this is just one puzzle piece, one little pot fragment. But still, I think it is a very, well, Arnoud, as he told me, thought it was important also to a younger generation to realize that this happened in this century, this kind of political situation where these scientific finds were actually at odds with what a present regime would want. And it's not that long ago that such a society could exist. So anything to make people aware of that, how close that has been, is good. Now, actually, the trigger for this event to happen was the ceremony happening in March earlier this year. This was where the remains of the village and the observatory itself were awarded the blue plaque status, which is actually a heritage status to be a protected area within Magaliesberg. And this is testament to the efforts of many people, among whom Vincent Carruthers and his wife Jane, who were actually strong advocates of well, this whole area of Magaliesberg, but specifically also these sites within it and the role that they played in the realization of um, uh, of its heritage. And yes, I should maybe also mention that to me this was fun fact to tell and to discover. In the press release that put Arnoud on the front page, he wasn't a fan of being on the front page. Um, Also, it mentioned that his wife, Constance, led some of the efforts to make those excavations of the fragments. And I was, well, I was surprised by that because I hadn't had her name attached to it. So I spoke with her last week and she explained what that pertained to. Indeed, when the Revel Mason was ill, she actually became the de facto in charge of the operations around this excavation site. Around this around this time, some really interesting finds were done, and thanks to her efforts, some of the rubble that emerged was not just thrown away, but actually preserved. And that was Revel Mason was really glad when that happened. So she also contributes, like Arnoud, to the preservation of the history of this area. I should also mention that Tshwane University of Technology is very adamant in this preservation effort and are also contributing to conserving this site and promoting its importance. Specifically, both the archaeological site and the observatory deserve preservation, and they're making an effort to make that happen. And I think, well, at least morally, I would like to support them also by giving this lecture to make that happen. So, again, a strong thanks for Vincent and Jane Carruthers by paving the way into uh, emancipating this story of the whole area, and also to Arno van Genderen championing curiosity and humanity. So with that, I thank you for your attention. So we could do questions now or questions during drinks. Any questions from overseas or okay. Okay.
Um, since my late teens, I wanted to study. Um, I have a life course. Since my late teens, I wanted to study geology, just because of the tectonics, the plate tectonics,
Mm.
etc.
Hmm.
I was so amazed by how the Earth moved around and changed, etc. But I wound up as an historian. Sorry.
Well, it's all history, right?
As always. Yes, yes. My question would be, I have several questions. I mean, I have 50 questions, I think. But I think let's stick to the observatory
Hmm.
in South Africa
Hmm.
and the white community being Christian, being brought up with the Bible,
Hmm.
which says that the Earth only exists 5,000 years. Sorry.
Yeah.
How did you both encounter that kind of reactions? Because you tell a quite different story than the Bible does. That's probably my first question.
Can I answer that?
Yes.
I think in during the days that we were there, we had so little contact with the local South Africans, and the few South Africans that we did have contact with, we did not have to convince that the Earth was quite a bit older than 5,000 years. It never came up because we all knew what the real story was. But I can tell you that my wife and I, in 1970 and 71, we lived not on the observatory because there was no housing available then, and we lived on in a little college some kilometers away. where we had only one neighbor, which was an Afrikaner family, and they were really, really of the ultra conservative kind. The first month or so, we had good relations, and then they went on holidays, and then the man who looked after their garden also did some work for us, and that was the start of a huge conflict because we were spoiling the market, of course. And from then on, for the next 15 months or so, we never spoke a word. So it never came up.
One more question, because all I see in all your lectures, by the way, thank you so much. I enjoyed your lectures, but I don't see people of color. I don't see black people. I don't see, because the importance of the archaeological findings are the identity
Yeah.
of black people, brown people in South Africa.
Yeah.
And you might have read the book a couple of years ago, read by it was called The Lie of 1652 by what's his name? Um, yes, thank you. Um, in which he also starts with all the archaeological findings and all the that there was uh, 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 that people were living there, had their uh, villages, had their beschaving, and everything, and it was thrown away by white people during, and not only apartheid regime but also before. So how do you consider, let me ask the other way around. Next time you will give a lecture, is it possible that you uh, tell us a bit more about that aspect of
Yeah. Yeah.
this very important story? Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for your question. And I realized this also in preparing the lecture. Um, I well, of course, because of time constraints, of course, and also the rich material that was already presented, I had to choose a focus. But I actually got stuck by this in this part where I really wanted to make more effort to pay homage to what happened actually from this Stone Age and Iron Age thing onto the Boer War and to where apartheid emerged. And there I would really want to consult voices from Black Africans. Yes, yes, of course. And I mean, I know that at this Tshwane University, I mean, the only photo that contains Black people is when the ceremony happened. Yeah, of course. Diving deeper into this topic, I want to hear this firsthand from the people who are there now, belonging to any community. Yes, and yeah, I'm just still scratching the surface in this, but thanks for highlighting that. Yes, yeah. Oh yes, maybe yeah,
There are also the houses of the personnel,
yeah,
and I met those people. Uh, they were very nice people. I mean, I can say more because I have no experience really in South Africa.
the,
But there's this house of Meas and Ludik and Solomon Ludik. They live there
yeah.
on houses provided by the Leiden Observatory.
Yes, this is something that was told to me by both Jan Willem, but also by Arnoud, that on the premises of the observatory, indeed, there were a couple of black families, and they were actually between your households. There was quite on fair equal grounds, being part of each other's daily life, right? And that's when,
Family members were part of personnel for decades.
yeah,
And they got Dutch pensions after the
yeah,
closed.
yeah. I got the impression in your remote community, so to speak, this was not regime didn't trickle down that visibly. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Other questions in the audience? Maybe from our main
Also not.
no questions? All right. Then, if there are no further questions, then I would like to thank Lucas Ellerbroek and Jan L. We have a gift for you for your next time here too. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Dank jullie allemaal voor het bijwonen van deze interessante lezing. En we gaan door met borrel.